In this study unit, we're going to be exploring the concept of cooperative strategy. So, organisations working together and through that gaining competitive advantage. Now, central to this area is the question about what activities a particular business should perform inside the firm and which it should buy in from the market. So, what should it own versus what should it buy in? Now, if we look first at buying in from the market, well, here the assumption is that the market system, through competition and regulation, coordinates the flow of goods and services between firms. But in that also allows flexibility. The firm can pick and choose who it works with, when it works, and make choices based on the performance of particular potential suppliers. Now here, over the long term, competition ensures the effectiveness of those suppliers. If they're not on the top of their game, then they get selected out by those competitive forces. The relationship between the companies is transactional. So company A sells a product or a service, so sells a property right to company B, and in return company A receives revenue or the equivalent, and the exchange happens because it's in the interest of both parties. Both company A and company B end up being better off as a result of that transaction. However, that transaction is not without friction. There are what is called transactional costs. Company B has to decide what it's going to buy in. So time and effort are taken to make that decision. It then has to search for a suitable supplier, or if you're company A, search for a suitable customer. There is then the negotiation and the time that takes to agree a price and the terms of the sale. And then there are the transfer costs, the packaging and shipping and unpacking of the product that is being exchanged. So it's not only a case that the exchange happens because the parties end up better off, but also where those transaction costs don't cancel out all the benefits either side receives. Sounds straightforward. Unfortunately, it's not. Those transaction costs are difficult to define in the real world. There are many risks that mean that those transaction costs may be different to what you expect. And theorists talk about three factors that can influence the scale of those transaction costs. Firstly, and we've covered this in a previous study unit, bounded rationality. The players in the transaction are uncertain about the environment in which they're operating in, and also about the future of that environment. So how much of that uncertainty and the associated risk do you build into your calculation? And it's not just the external environment. The complexity of the operations mean that often you cannot define exactly what you want, so can't describe it into an enforceable contract. Those are all added to by a lack of transparency. You don't know the position of the other player, and so there's risk in terms of making that transaction, particularly where it lasts over time. The second factor that researchers like Williamson and Course raise is opportunism. One player in the transaction has market power and therefore is not subject to the usual market pressures that ensure that the other player is getting an appropriate price for that transaction, and may mean any contract between those players is unenforceable. In this space, you've also got the questions of loss of control perhaps over intellectual property. And so the other player taking advantage of those insights without proper recompense. And then the third factor that is raised is asset specificity. This is about whether an activity calls for any specialised investment. Perhaps a supplier needs to purchase particular plant or equipment, or recruit and train specialist people in order to engage in the transaction. If that investment cannot easily be redeployed onto other activities at equivalent terms, the party is then bound to the other, tied to the other, potentially placing them at a disadvantage should circumstances change or in future renegotiations. Now, where all three of those factors exist, the risks are much higher, and that risk has to be built into the exchange, and therefore reduces, if not eliminates, the benefit that either player is receiving as a result of that transaction. The cost of controlling those risks may therefore mean that the market is not the best solution for acquiring particular inputs into your production process. So let's turn to the other side of the coin. If the market is not the solution, maybe having those activities inside the hierarchy of the firm is the solution. You own the activities and the resources that enable those activities. As a result of that ownership, that you have control over the activities and therefore over the costs involved, and you can coordinate the interaction between different parts of the process, and you can ensure transparency of what is going on, and so you can see where inefficiencies and internal transaction costs are occurring. However, there are also additional costs involved in bringing activities into the hierarchy. There is, to start with, a loss of flexibility. You can't quickly switch to different activities or resources that you could if you were simply buying in those activities from the market. Also, there are agency costs, i.e. the cost of controlling those systems and putting in governance of the people involved in the organisation. You have to find a way to incentivise individuals in a way that replaces that market pressure that ensured efficiency. There's also other costs of ownership, for example, opportunity costs. Having made the investment into owning particular activities, you may no longer be able to grasp other opportunities that come along that need different activities or different resources. So, in your decision of make versus buy, there are pros and cons for both the market and in terms of bringing those activities into the hierarchy. Yes, with the market, you get market pressure to have efficiency, so high-powered incentives to drive effectiveness and efficiency, but there are transaction costs which will erode the benefits you get in that market solution. In the hierarchy, you get control and coordination of what is happening, but there is bureaucracy and there are ownership costs. So the question whether to buy in activities from the market or bring them in hierarchy depends on organising those activities in a way that minimises costs while simultaneously safeguarding the organisation against risks. However, we can't see this question just in terms of an either or. We fully go to the market, we trade in the market, or we bring activities into the hierarchy, whether that's through buying in other organisations or setting up our own activities. The reality is that this is a spectrum between the market and the hierarchy. And in between lies the area of cooperative strategy, of strategic alliances. Now, a strategic alliance is defined as the relationship between two or more independent firms that involves the sharing of resources or capabilities to achieve mutually relevant benefits. And we see many examples, of such strategic alliances in many different fields. Now, those alliances can exist between just two partners, or they can form the basis of a consortium of network of alliances. Airbus started off as a consortium of alliances across Europe to develop an aircraft to compete with Boeing, who also use a network of suppliers. And in today's world, there is an increasing attractiveness for such cooperative strategies. As competitive pressures have increased, as indeed have cost pressures, alliances have become an increasingly attractive way to increase the utilisation of your resources, to increase scale, to access markets and expertise, so to improve the economies of the existing business, or to develop new businesses as development costs of new products increase and products and services have shorter life cycles. Alliances being used to increase the speed and decrease the cost of new product introduction, and also to do expensive new research, as you find extensively in the pharmaceutical industry these days. Now, strategic alliances can be of many types, varying from contract-based partnerships to full joint ventures between organisations. There are increasingly different types of partnerships being invented. So it's possibly easier to think of these in terms of the mix of governance approaches used in these partnerships. In some partnerships, you'll find there are equity holdings by both parties in the relationship, whether that is setting up a separate joint venture that the two partners have ownership of, or whether it's cross-holding in shares of each partner. Effectively here, the interests in each organisation acts as mutual hostages against opportunism. Strategic alliances often will have an explicit contractual governance mechanism, a formal contract put in place by the two parties that define control and administrative commitments grounded in a legal document. But not everything can be defined into a contract. So in these relationships, you will also see non-equity links, mutual understanding and trust between the partners, often based on their reputation and history of working together. So in any partner, you will see a mix of these different approaches that bind these organisations together. So a wide variety of types of strategic alliance that are becoming increasingly popular. So how do we look strategically at these strategic alliance? Well, let's go back to our four models of where competitive advantage comes from and look at how these might provide insight onto particular alliances. If we start with Porter's theories of choice and alignment, well, here Porter's theories would imply that through that partnership, the activity system of the two organisations is being aligned and you're developing a higher order of fit. So here there are challenges about the longevity of that partnership and the degree of integration required to achieve that level of fit. And as a result, given the challenges that this perspective of strategy implies, it would tend to mean the alliance's focus is likely to be on a separate joint venture within which you take clear strategic choices and can build the level of fit required to gain sustainable competitive advantage. Turning to the blue ocean perspective of strategy, well, here you'll be looking at the two partners jointly developing blue ocean moves. And here the challenges will be about the allocation of the benefits. And again, you're likely to see this thinking resulting in a joint venture rather than the full integration of the firms in this partnership. A good example here would be the smart car, developed in a joint venture between Mercedes and SMH, the Swiss company who developed the Swatch, where in that joint venture vehicle, a blue ocean move away from traditional cars was made. Moving on to the resource-based view, over here we'd see alliances in a very different way. Either for a firm, that partnership itself is a core competency. So that specific relationship for the firm does pass the Varro test. It's valuable, so customers are coming to you because of what that partnership allows you to do. It is rare, no one else has that partnership. It is inimitable, so others can't displace you or get the same thing. And here, given the nature of partnerships, it is likely to be those non-equity links that provide that protection. In Barney's words, providing social complexity. And of course, you gain the value out of having that partnership. Alternatively, alliance and partnerships can provide a source of non-core competencies and resources. Having identified the competencies that are giving you advantage, you would be looking to outsource other activities. And an alliance, a partnership, gives you a way to control the transaction costs in that relationship. As a contrast between these two views, compare the joint venture Ningbo Bird, which is a relationship between Bird and the state-owned company NEIG. Bird, through that relationship, gained access to licenses in China, so a valuable and rare relationship. Compare that with a firm just using Amazon's fulfillment service or using an outsourcer like Cognizant. Very efficient at certain activities, but not rare, and anyone can access that same service. And then in terms of the fourth view, the dynamic capabilities perspective, this view places emphasis on how an alliance or a portfolio of alliances aids the deployment of current advantages or is part of bringing new resources into the firm. Now here the alliances could be of any sort. The emphasis is on the processes, the routines that consistently manage those alliances to address the resource portfolio of the firm. Good example is Canon's approach to partnerships in accessing resources and new learning to access new market opportunities. Now, this is a viewpoint that we will explore in the next video. So, strategic alliances and competitive advantage. Well, management needs to choose which activities and resources it should perform in the hierarchy of the firm and which it buys in from the market. Both the hierarchy and market approaches do result in costs, and the choice needs to assess and compare the transaction costs and ownership costs, and so choosing the lesser of those, and therefore gaining the maximum benefit out of a transaction and the activities involved. Strategic alliances are a halfway house that provides some of the benefits of both ownership and of the market. And this approach has become increasingly popular over the last few decades. Now, different theories and strategies suggest different ways of looking at and assessing strategic alliances. They each provide insights that help our thinking. And in the next video, we'll drill down into the way in which you manage alliances, which is very much aligned to the dynamic capabilities perspective. So thank you for watching.